Well, welcome everybody. As we start preparing for tonight's webinar with Dr. Philip Woods, really exciting subject tonight. Really excited to get Philip with us. See, we've got lots and lots of people who are joining. Again, all flipping in from the waiting room. You're very welcome from, again, I can see from all around the world. It's fantastic to see some hardy regulars, if I can call you that, chaps and chapesses, and some visitors as well from India, Canada, yes, the United States. Oh, hello from Louisiana, fantastic Lutkins. Really, really fascinating subject tonight. And at that, I'm going to hand over to Sylvia to allow us to get underway.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to our first 2026 KET webinar. May I take the opportunity to wish you all a happy new year, even if I'm allowed to at the end of January. I hope so, but let's hope it's a good one for all of us. Well, it may be the first webinar of ours this year, but it is also the KET's 40th webinar altogether, which is incredible. And over the last few years, we have built up an amazing library of fascinating talks, with thanks to all of our presenters. And all of them are available to watch on our website for free. Since the last webinar, you will have received our latest newsletter, which was such a pleasure to write this year, as we are now back at full steam once again, supporting young Nagas with their education. And the newsletter gives all the details of our teaching project. If any of you would like to have spare hard copies of the newsletter, please just let me know and I'll be more than happy to send some to you. Now we are back up into full fundraising mode. These are a great way of spreading the word, which I know many of you do for us anyway. But now to tonight, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Philip Woods, the author of the recently published book, Managing the Media in the India-Burma War, which is the subject of our webinar this evening. Dr. Woods will explore how the media were used by governments and armed forces during the Burma campaign to project the most positive image to domestic and international audiences of a war that often seemed neglected or misunderstood. Soldiers were able, by the first time in such a distant theatre, to have fast access to newspapers, magazines and radio broadcasts, relating stories of the campaigns they were actively engaged in. The media, therefore, had an important impact on troop morale, positively or negatively. Mountbatten was determined to challenge the talk of the forgotten war and the forgotten army by all means available. And this talk assesses the methods he used and the extent to which he succeeded. Steering the ship, as always, is Dr. Robert Lyman. As ever, please feel free to use the chat button. And if you have a question, we would love to hear from you on the Q&A button, please, which Rob and Philip will tackle at the end of the presentation. Thank you, and over to you now, Rob.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And again, it's a great pleasure to welcome so many of our friends on tonight. It's an even greater pleasure for me to welcome Philip, who's going to take us through the presentation. I came across Philip many years ago. He's been an enormous help to me in my own work. Through his first book, Reporting the Retreat, which I would heartily recommend. I've had a look online today and it's certainly available in various places, War Correspondence in Burma. You will know, if you know anything about 1942, that there are a large number of books published contemporaneously by war correspondents. And if you go on to newspapers.com, you can actually read the story of the campaign from day to day, all reported by these characters. And Philip puts all of that into some rigorous context. And of course, the latest book produced during COVID, during lockdown, which is the subject of tonight's conversation about how the government or how the armed forces manage a positive spin on how the war is reported. And of course, you will all know that at the time, 1942 and 43, it would take 6 weeks for news to trickle out of the UK back to India. By the time the news got to the UK, It was quite old anyway, and for that reason, soldiers felt themselves out of the loop. The story can be exaggerated a little bit. I need to remind people that by 1944, troops were corresponding by aerogram back home, and they were getting them. Aerograms were being sent home within days, not weeks. But to talk about the entire context of how you manage communications to an army of 1.3 million men and some women, Philip, a very warm welcome to the KET webinars, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. And thank you, Sylvia, for inviting me. And I have to say, I'm proud. This is the 40th webinar. I've followed quite a few of them, and I've learned a lot from them. So thank you very much indeed. Yes, well, you've saved me the first slide, really saying much about the first book, but it was a study of these 24 war correspondents. And the idea of the book really was to try to test the value of what they wrote and what they projected, because it also covers newsreel and cinema material, is to test the value of what they wrote, whether it's sort of likely to be accurate, whether they were just propagandists for the army and the government, or whether they tried their best to tell a truthful story. And in doing that, I was able to look at not only what they published at the time, but also to look at their memoirs and also diaries. And probably the diaries were the most reliable form of all. So the more recent book, Managing the Media in the India-Burma War, and I was keen on the photograph that went into the book at the cover, because Mountbatten, as you'll see, is going to be one of the heroic figures, if you like, in this story. It has a subtitle which is Challenging a Forgotten War. And I'm going to leave much of the discussion about the challenge to the forgotten war to the end. That is my view, if you like, about the way I know I don't like the term anymore, the repetition of the cliche term forgotten war, but it's so widely used that I think I'm going to lose the argument, in all honesty. I counted up in my bibliography, I think there were 14 books using the word forgotten. And I realized that back in 2004, a review of John Latimer's book called The Forgotten War protested and said, this is not accurate. This is no longer forgotten. There are lots of books on this subject. And I think since then it's multiplied and multiplied. But let's see. My publisher, when choosing the title of the book, wanted it to be called The Forgotten War. And I said, well, really, there's a whole chapter arguing against that idea. So I don't think it's a good idea to use that. So that's the challenge. To see how embedded the Forgotten War is, one can think of last year's 80th anniversary of the victory over Japan, celebrate the commemorations, and also those 5 years earlier, the 75th. And I think they were wonderful events, and they really did bring to the forefront the war in Burma. And the Royal British Legion certainly played a part in that. This is their website that they used, and it's nice that they showed the multinational, multi-ethnic force that was key in fighting the war on. But what they said there was that there were no live radio or TV broadcasts on the Burma campaign. So for most of the public, they had very little knowledge beyond the odd newspaper report of what was happening. And in a way, that's what I'm trying to challenge. I'm not denying that it was an underreported war. But there were at various times quite a lot of reporters available for there. And I think the different forms of media that were used, particularly in 1944, 1945, suggested there was a much greater uptake, basically, of media coverage, which in my view is an important part of counteracting the problems of low morale, which particularly affected the troops in 1942 and 1943, when the term Forgotten War was first used by a newspaper correspondent, by the way, 1943. So if we go back to the 1942 subject to my first book, and I suppose one should say, for those who may not be terribly au fait with this part of the Second World War in Asia, this is, of course, very typical, I suppose, of British experiences during the 20th century warfare, a war of two halves. The first half, Britain totally unprepared and a disastrous military campaign in so many ways, and one in a way that probably the government would have preferred to have fewer war correspondents actually covering this campaign. But there are 24 accredited war correspondents. Accredited is quite important because it means people sign up to the rules that the army is setting down for a war correspondent to report the war, which means that they have to wear uniform, they become officers, rank of captain, and they agree to abide by censorship rules. They agree to be accompanied by a conducting officer, and very often they will have to share jeeps and other means of transport with other correspondents. So it's actually quite difficult for them to make the sort of scoops that they're keen to get. The war correspondents come from different countries. The Governor Reginald Dorman Smith called them vultures when they arrived. They were critical of the governor and the whole process of evacuation of Rangoon. But in many ways, in my book, I describe them more as refugees because they were coming from Singapore, for instance, and from Thailand and from China. China, where the censorship was really strong, and obviously Singapore, where the censorship was also very strong, but also, of course, reporting a fairly disastrous campaign as well. And one that was very fully reported, of course, in the British media. So of those correspondents, we'll see we get some people, O'Dowd Gallagher. You know, most of these correspondents are actually very experienced. Not only have they reported war and all the way that you see the retreat of civilian populations in wartime and the killings involved, but they've also reported from Ethiopia in the 1930s, from Spain, and the various European conflicts going up until the Second World War. So they know a lot more than the army public relations people. So when they're censored, they often feel quite aggrieved, and that's why you get this sort of bitterness amongst some, like O'Dowd Gallagher. He has actually been dragged oily from the sea off Singapore. He was on the Repulse when it was sunk. So you can imagine he wasn't very happy after his experiences when he got to Burma. The result of the situation that was going badly so quickly, of course, we're talking now about a 5-month or so campaign. So the correspondents have to, if you like, keep up quite fast with the changes that are taking place over a territory, you know, the length of something like France. So it's really difficult for them to get around, particularly in the early parts of the campaign when they don't really have even transport to do so. The response of the public relations organization is really defensive or reactive. There's no real, it's not easy for them to manage the media in the way I would have hoped you would find in the army, because they're reacting very quickly to situations that are extremely difficult. And the main response, I should say, is to rely on censorship, and even more, to rely on self-censorship. Self-censorship reflects the fact that these correspondents are embedded. That is, they are assigned, as I say, in uniform to various units, and they may fly in planes on bombing raids and so forth with the RAF and so forth. And so it's very important to recognize that not only do they see this as a war for national survival against fascist and extremely dangerous enemies, but they are very sympathetic to the soldiers that they work with. If they're not always terribly sympathetic to the commanders, they're not allowed to show it. So for the most part, you won't find that either. Their reports, therefore, tend, I suppose, to concentrate their criticisms more on the governor and the government rather than on the military at all, or military tactics. They have to wait until they leave the country, usually May. Some leave as early as March because of censorship. But they have to leave it then till their memoirs or in newspaper reports afterwards to give their idea of what went wrong. The other thing they can do is use positive stories, and the one that I would point to in a moment is the American volunteer group. This is the American volunteer pilots who, along with the RAF, played a very important role in delaying the Japanese advance in Burma, at least for a time. And they provided quite a romantic story, which was very much, it was easiest to report because the airport from which the planes flew off was very close to Rangoon. And very often the correspondents didn't have the transport to move far away from that initially. So this is a story that's very good for American correspondents in particular, who they know the government is really interested in the Burma Road, the means by which transport of Lend-Lease commodities can be taken from the port of Rangoon in the south, right up north across the border, 1,000 miles or so, into China. And so this is a very positive story, as we'll see in a moment. The censorship rules, I won't go into these in detail, they can be a bit tedious, but just to give you an impression of the restrictions, if you think of these being applied rather widely, matter calculated to impair the efficiency, morale, or discipline of, or to prejudice recruiting for His Majesty's forces. That's a key point for India, of course, where most of the recruitment is going to take place. For instance, disparagement of those in command of His Majesty's forces, or to create or encourage disaffection in any section of the population, in any part of the British Empire. This could be very wide-ranging. Don't forget there's a nationalist movement in full blast in India at this point, the Quit India campaign. Many of the Congress leaders have been locked up. And this is going to be very difficult for the Indian government to know how they can perhaps control the correspondence in what they actually say. At the bottom there, number 8, such information regarding subversive movements, well, that would account for the Quit India movement, agrarian or industrial unrest, and communal disturbances, that's inter-ethnic rivalry, as might be calculated to raise the morale of the enemy. So it's the India situation that's most in mind, I think, even when we get to Southeast Asia Command. This is still an issue that's still quite live because there's a great deal of sensitivity in India about the way the reporting is made. This is one of the sort of veteran, he's really a foreign correspondent more than a war correspondent, Lee Stowe. But he comes from China, where he's not able to report these stories, nationalist China, which is the Burma Road scandal exposed. That is, he's found there's so much corruption amongst the Chinese who are running the Burma Road that basically a lot of Lend-Lease material is not getting through and a lot of money is being siphoned off. And he does send in these stories, and the Chinese embassy in Washington complains, and it gets back to the government in Britain, and they send instructions to Dorman Smith, the governor in Burma, and he calls in Lee Stowe and says, I think you're quite right in these articles, but I'd rather you stop writing them, please. And Lee Stowe agrees. So he gets 3 out of, I think, 7 or so of these articles actually published. He also plays an important part with the AVG, the Flying Tigers, as they're popularly known, because he's the man who tries to keep a tally of how many planes have been shot down, what the score is. And this is important because these are, if you like, mercenary pilots. They're there for the money, and they make quite a lot of money according to each of the planes they've shot down. So trying to keep a proper record, or at least as close as you could get, is useful for them. The photos are by George Roger, who is the life photographer who covers the Burma campaign and does it extremely well. And he uses a lot of these personalized stories of each of these pilots, telling you about their girlfriends at home and the cattle ranch that their parents are running and all this sort of business, which goes down very well. And it's the sort of thing that the British don't really allow. So they're really missing out until I think late in 1944 when they begin to properly name the regiments involved and so forth. Interesting, when we talked, I mean, Rob talked about the numbers involved. 24 is not bad for Burma at that stage, actually. It means there's enough people there to cover. Ideally, you might have two correspondents from each paper because one would be at the front and the other would be at headquarters. And that would, either one of them would be able to, well, one would make probably a on-the-spot report, which would be lively, and the other would keep up with the communiques and any press conferences that were made and send those back more quickly, perhaps. But if you compare those, in 1942, there are 92 correspondents in the Desert War in North Africa. And so this reflects immediately the press and the public are more interested in what's going on in the Mediterranean, North Africa, Middle East, than they are in distant territories. It's not to say there isn't quite good reporting at this stage, but it's not getting nearly the attention of other campaigns nearer to home. Compare that again with the SEAC correspondence, Southeast Asia Command, 1944 to 45, when there are 88 correspondents. And I think there are something like six or eight film newsreel correspondents there at the end in 1945, which is the highest number by far. If you go back to 1942, there's only two film newsreel correspondents and one, I think, in 1943. And newsreel is a very important way the public in cinema, going to the cinema once or twice a week in Britain at that point, and they have to see these newsreels. So it's before television, it's the visual way in which they get up this news. Compare this with 558 correspondents for D-Day landings, which is quite extraordinary, obviously. And then we go back to 1943, as I say, a campaign of two halves, retreat in 1942, and then the attempt in 1943 to get back into Burma, at least to attack in Arakan, the first Arakan campaign in 1943. There are only 14 correspondents there during the first campaign and the first Wingate campaign, which takes place simultaneously. So this gives an indication of why soldiers, there are lots of other reasons for low morale, but one of the reasons is that the lack of coverage that they get, basically, for what they're doing in very difficult terrain, very difficult weather, very difficult circumstances fighting the Japanese. All I can see from this colourful map is that Allies retreat. You can see an arrow going backwards, and that's the message, I suppose, that one will get from the Arakan campaign. It is worse than anything, really, because it's not been well prepared, and the end result is that the commander, the Noel Irwin, I think Rob has written very critically of Noel Irwin, quite rightly. He orders a blackout of news for, I think, about 10 or 12 days, which causes a lot of controversy amongst, people in Calcutta and so forth. What's happening? What's happening? And there's the Statesman newspaper makes a big protest about that. Worse than that, he then decides that he will try and have a news conference with the correspondents. And in the process of that, he basically blames the soldiers who are not prepared. He says British soldiers are just not prepared like the Japanese. And, it doesn't really go down well. And unfortunately, he has to go home ill. So we don't have any more Noel Irwin. Fortunately, in a way, at the same time, there is another operation which is taking place, which gives more of an opportunity for publicity. In fact, the story is that after the low morale, the one thing that really raises morale is the fact in May 1943, the story is brought home of the Chindit long-range penetration group operation, which was quite remarkable, certainly. And the remarkable leader, of course, made for wonderful stories. Stories about, this eccentric officer who always carried raw onions to eat and had an alarm clock round his belt so that he would know exactly how to get on with the next project and so forth. That wasn't the most eccentric thing about Wingate, of course. The military ideas were also unusual in one sense, in that they didn't always link up with perhaps the other campaigns taking place, such as in Arakan. But Wingate did have an eye to publicity. Sometimes people sort of say, oh, that he didn't, but he did, entering this campaign on a white horse, for instance, with the newsreels filming him to do this, indicates he was interested in publicity, obviously, because he wanted a bigger campaign next time round, substantially bigger. And Wingate, the Wingate expedition, the interesting thing about it is that there are correspondents who actually follow the first stage of the campaign as far as the River Chinwin. And here they are, three of them, in fact. The two on the left and the one on the far right are journalists. Don't know how you can tell that, but they are. The one in the middle, the third one from the left, is actually a photographer, a cine photographer. He's actually an artist, but he'll serve the purpose of being a Sydney photographer for this purpose. And then the man next to him, the moustache, he's in effect a conducting officer or somebody who's a military journalist. Military journalists were quite useful from the point of view of the army because they didn't need to be other people showing them around or anything. They could cover a lot more. But they couldn't always report it, of course. The official reporters or the correspondents were the ones who were professional at doing this, and they couldn't outdo them. Now, the interesting thing about these people is that this is just by chance that any journalists cover this beginning of this expedition, which is going to take months. Because it's only at the very last minute that, somebody points out, really, shouldn't we have some journalists on this? And they add these people to it. But they tell them, you're only going to the Chinwin, and then you go back. When you go back, you can't report it. You can't report it for months, basically. Can you imagine journalists having to keep quiet with news that they've got for several weeks, basically? And apart from giving hints about this was Wingate's operation, they do pretty much stick to that idea. So when they come back, Wingate gives a very good press conference in May, and the story begins to come out. Then the press are allowed to report it, and they make all of the material that they've got goes into, front page news and so forth, because it's exciting. Stories about, monocles being dropped to generals who have lost theirs in the field, or, you know, one general who needed his snuff, apparently, snuff powder sent to him by aeroplane, and it got mixed up with curry powder, apparently. So that must have been an added entertainment. Um, this is thought to be a turning point in many ways because the press really built this up as a great achievement. And the news gets back, partly through Wingate's report himself, it gets back to Churchill, and Churchill says, "Oh, Wingate, you've got to come to the Quebec conference now that's going to take place. Oh, and bring your wife if you can as well." Um, the important thing is Churchill sees this is the one positive story he's got to tell the Americans, that we are doing something offensive in the land war in Burma. And so this is how things are taken up. But the publicity is really, it continues after this. At the time, I have pointed out that there are, you can be perhaps a bit skeptical about the claims that this is an amazing turning point in morale and so forth, because there are very high casualty rates. He only takes British troops for the most part, and really, I think a lot of it is built up by the press. Unfortunately, also there is the Dam Busters raid taking place at the same time, and that gets more coverage, not surprisingly, over a longer period of time. So the coverage in the press lasts a few days, basically, not much longer than that, until the photographs come out, which is a little bit later. After that, the PROs do manage an effective campaign in America. This is material in the newspapers that was put out by Charles Rollo, not only in this form, but also in writing, about Wingate's raiders, as he called them. And I love the drawing on the right-hand side. Wingate stood like some minor prophet, which is exactly, I think, where Wingate was coming from. His background was in Plymouth Brethren family, so you can see why they were taking this idea. There was another correspondent, interesting correspondent, Wilfred Burchett, Australian, who managed to persuade Wingate. He apparently barged in on Wingate one day. Wingate was, as usual, naked in bed, sort of brushing himself with a toothbrush or something. And he got him to make several interviews. And he wrote up this book called Wingate Adventure. It came out in Australia, came out in India. And it's an exciting story, but there have been quite a lot of complaints that he overdid it and played down perhaps the rate of the casualty losses, and also maybe overplayed the strategic value of what Wingate was actually doing. We come on to the second part now, the more positive part, if you like, of the war in Burma from the British perspective. And this map just gives a quick idea of where the campaign is going to take place. We're particularly interested in reporting from the American point of view, of course, which is the attempt to go from Ledo to Myitkyina, further south here, which is going to be Stilwell's. Stilwell eventually gets not only Chinese troops, but some American troops as well. And this is going to be an important story to follow, because it's going to try and reopen the Burma Road, which eventually is successful, but not until 1945, really. So that campaign is going on. And of course, the American reporters, and there is a very strong PRO, public record relations organization for the American troops, which is arguing that basically this is the only offensive work going on at this time in 1943, 44. There's no mention of the British successes in Arakan against the Hargo attempt by the Japanese to provide a feint in preparation for the Yugo um, campaign, which is going to try to get into India through Imphal and Kohima in 1944. So um, these are obviously key for reporting. And at this stage, of course, uh, the important thing is we have a new commander. After the Quebec conference, Lord Louis Mountbatten is appointed as Supreme Commander Southeast Asia. And he is a man who's very keen on publicity. You may well say self-publicity, which, yes, was the case to an extent. But he was also very media savvy, very technological savvy too. And he makes conditions on appointment, saying, there must be a proper public relations organization. I want the best editors from London to come out. I want the best newspaper men. I want the BBC to come out. Um, I want my own newspaper. I want my own SEAC newspaper, but also magazine, and also I want a radio station as well. So not very much to ask, but he's very keen and very clever in the way that he goes about getting these things. You can see him next to Stilwell, General Stilwell, the American general. Look at the contrast in what they wear. Mountbatten loved to put on a full uniform, even if he was going in the most horrible jungle conditions. And Stilwell laughed at this because, of course, the image he's got here is, fairly scruffy with this rifle always strung over the back, And he said that, the first time Mountbatten came to see him, he had 16 aircraft with him. And he just couldn't take seriously this idea of this, supreme commander who always wanted to stand on boxes to talk to his troops. It's really just a matter of different forms of self-publicity. Stilwell presented this Vinegar Joe, man of the soldiers sort of approach, simple, straight talking and so forth. And Mountbatten, pushed, well, he was a member of the royal family, of course, but he pushed all the time the idea that, he was there to raise the morale of the troops after such a long time when things were going badly. And of course, the key thing also is General Slim is appointed, and this is going to be a turning point too, as commander of the 14th Army, which is going to be a key area for publicity during 1944, 1945, and people are supposed to get to know the name of the 14th Army and its commander. And this is the first newspaper that they get published. This is the Forces newspaper. It's a 4-page newspaper, and it's called SEAC, nothing very surprising. And nothing very surprising, it has Lord Mountbatten on the front page. And it basically tells the soldiers about what's going on in the rest of the war, but also what's happening in Southeast Asia, Burma, and gives them an opportunity also to catch up with what's going on at home. And it gives them an opportunity through the letters column to write, about their grievances and so forth. And Mountbatten is very clear about this. He doesn't want them censored. He wants them to be able to say what they think and what they write. So this is very positive, I think, in terms of his approach. The newspapers do respond. And this is the Illustrated London News, 7th of October, 1944. And you can see here that Slim is there, but also this is the point at which, after the successful Imphal and Kohima campaigns, that the 3 other corps commanders are also given knighthoods. So 4 are given knighthoods at the same time, which is, I think, quite unprecedented. So this is good publicity. The point about this newspaper is that it was, I think there were 100,000 copies to be sent out. They would reach the fighting front on the same day. So they would be flown in by aircraft, specially set aside. And so the troops would get news, some of it, from home because the special arrangements were made to fly out airmail newspapers, um, which were incorporated in the SEAC. And this was quite a remarkable operation, I think, to at least let the soldiers know quickly what was going on. I've just put in this picture really to show the sloppiness of the American army. But no, really, what I'm trying to show is there was an impact in the fact that soldiers, this is the first time really, I think, in warfare in this area, long distance away from home, that soldiers could pick up newspapers, magazines, which always weren't always out of date, by the way. They did manage to get not necessarily Life magazine, that would probably be out of date, but the newspapers, the soldiers' newspapers, the Americans had a very good magazines as well, newspapers. So I think they played an important part in maintaining morale because soldiers were very aware, I think, of anything if they weren't reported for their achievements or if somebody failed to mention their regiment name, they could really get very annoyed about that. The BBC came in, and so there was reporting from Kohima, for instance, and Imphal. And these again, these recordings will be relayed eventually, and won't take very long, to the troops as well. So again, I think the BBC, that's a very important way, I think, for soldiers to realise that they are being taken notice of at home. There is a difficult point in 1944, the Kohima news blackout, basically, when things were going wrong in Kohima at the very beginning. And newspaper reporters said something about it was only invalids, basically, who were defending Kohima. That wasn't liked by the Army PRO, and they caused a stop. Again, another 10-day ban on newspaper reporting of what was going on. Again, well, this time it led to a strike amongst a number of the correspondents. And again, what happens is that the Supremo, Mountbatten, goes to talk to the correspondents and persuades them there will be no more what he calls political censorship. In other words, there'll only be security censorship. You're not allowed to tell things that are going to help the enemy, information that will help the enemy, but otherwise you can report more freely. He was rather hoist with his own petard because one of the reporters, who's one of the ones here, made a wonderful story, which was more like something that would go out in a property magazine about the green hell of Kandy, which was Kandy in Sri Lanka was the place that Mountbatten had as his headquarters. And it talked about the number of tennis courts that were being built, the swimming pools that were already there, and the canteens and so forth. It looked like a sort of, brochure for some luxury resort. And Mountbatten was furious and said, why has that got through censorship? And they said, well, actually, you haven't allowed anything that's not around security to be stopped. Have we time? This will take about 2 minutes, I think I'll show. Yeah, between 2 and 5, but I may stop at 2.
Here are the Brighton boys from Burma with a few words. Hello, dears. All my love to you, especially Lena. I'm okay, but longing to see you all again.
So you're about to meet the Brighton Boys. They are a group of British Army soldiers who served in Burma during the Second World War. The year is 1945 and the war's not quite over yet. So these individuals have been asked to step up to a camera and to speak from the heart. They're being asked to record personal messages home to their loved ones back in Britain.
Cheerio now, all my love, keep smiling. Okay, Rich. Hello, Mother. Hello, Dad. Hope you're keeping both very fit, and that goes for the rest of the family out near Horsham too. As you can see, I'm pretty well and still get something to laugh at. Give my love to Vera, Peg, Kenneth and Pat, and tons for yourself. Cheerio for now. God bless you all and keep smiling. Get cracking, Ginger. Hello,
The series as a whole was produced by the Directorate for Army Welfare in India, and the purpose was really to raise morale. There was growing concern around this time that these troops that were thousands of miles from home were fast becoming the forgotten army, and the idea was to try to improve communication with home. One of the things that I find really fascinating about the Brighton Boys film is you can feel that palpable sense of separation. And yet there's this incredible spirit and camaraderie amongst them, the determination to get through it and be positive. Just count the number of times that they say, keep smiling.
It won't be long now. Cheerio, will you? Come on, Mike. Hello, Mum and Dad. My only thing is to wish Eileen and John the best of luck, and hoping to be back with you all again in England soon. All of us boys here are going to win the war and get back to you all a bit jolly. So cheerio, darling, and keep smiling. Come on, John.
Once they were done filming, the Brighton Boys would have been asked by the welfare officer, who out of your family and friends do you want us to write to? Give us their addresses, and we're going to invite them to a special screening at a cinema somewhere in the Brighton area. And they were going to bring all of the family and friends of all of these boys together under one roof to hear these special personal messages. Sometimes it took as long as 12 weeks for those films to get from the point of filming the boys to actually up there on the cinema screen. But it was well worth the wait. Can you imagine how emotionally charged those cinemas must have been? I mean, some of these families wouldn't have seen the faces of their loved ones for potentially years. They must have been full of laughter and tears of joy, and sometimes also tears of great sadness, because we do know that across the Calling Blighty series, there were some individual servicemen who were very sadly killed in action after being filmed.
Take care of yourself. Cheerio for now. Oh, George. Hello, Hilda, darling. Hello, champ. I bet you never expected to see me as a film star, but here I am. I'm feeling very...
It leads to just emphasizing, go back to make sure that I came out of that properly. Yeah. It leads to the point, really, that there is a big attempt by Mountbatten to bring up lots of different methods of actually trying to raise the morale of troops. And I think he was successful to a large extent in doing this. The problem is, of course, that there are other events taking place in 1944, D-Day particularly, and in 1945 with victory in Europe, which were going to be much bigger in terms of news than what was going on in Burma. And so I think the whole issue of the forgotten war is the thing I want to finish with. This is a very nice low campaign, which is basically pointing to the fact that the Japanese didn't regard this as a forgotten army by 1945, February 1945, when they were basically in full flight from the 14th Army before it reaches Rangoon and the end of the campaign. Now, very quickly, I'll just say something about the forgotten army epithet. I don't want to push it too far, but there's no doubt about the genuine feeling that there was about amongst the soldiers of being forgotten, but this was strong at the various times in the campaign. The times I pointed to in the first half of 1943, of course, for reasons that we've seen, when the military setbacks, media coverage was most limited. Then in late 1944, when the likelihood seemed of a victory over Germany, and how long would it be before the soldiers came back? Some of them had served for 5 years or so, and they might go on to a campaign in Southeast Asia. So conditions in Burma, the failure of other factors in soldier morale, particularly the lack of entertainment, the lack of beer, the lack of, all sorts of provisions, also was a key factor. And then in 1945 and VE Day, this also raised certainly this feeling that, why were people celebrating like mad as if the war was over when it wasn't? The war was still going on and looked like it would go on for a long time against Japan. And so this was an important, very important feeling. I don't think I'll say anything about the reasons that this has stayed as a factor in the Forgotten Army has gone on after the war is finished for a variety of reasons, I think. But I still feel that it's no longer uh, a good idea to continue using it. I think the Forgotten War is the one that I most would probably object to. Forgotten Army and all the different regiments and all the different battles and so forth seem to me, yes, they're underreported. And the historians are doing fantastic work in bringing all this stuff to light. But really, for the work of organisations like the Royal British Legion, the Burma Star Memorial Fund, Kohima Educational Trust, National Army Museum, Imperial War Museum, all of these bodies have done a tremendous job and in basically letting people know about the Burma campaign. And I think as a result, I would say that the role of our armed forces in this campaign will never be forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Philip. I'm personally delighted because I think that Mountbatten does get a bad rap, and I know your particular perspective on Mountbatten, which is in this time and place, he was absolutely critical to the victory that the 14th Army achieved. I mean, all armies need leadership, they need direction, they need purpose, they need a figurehead, and I think for all the Indian Army veterans I interviewed many years ago, one of them said to me, but he said, Rob, Mountbatten was the cousin of the King Emperor who wasn't going to pay attention to this. Britain finally was taking the war against the Japanese seriously, and we felt that Britain or London realized this. There are some questions, which are some of them are fabulous. They're all fabulous questions. Let me just ask you these, Philip. Were there any? This is from Darren Little. Were there any reporters, photographers from any neutral countries in Burma, either from Europe, South America? I can think of a Chinese reporter, but were there any? Certainly lots of Americans, but any neutral reporters off the top of your head? If we can't think of anything, we'll.
No, not off the top of my head. They're pretty much all people who are committed, involved as allies and whatever, because that's where the editors would have wanted the stories to be brought back from. Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, of course, Burma wasn't new news in 1942. It was quite old news because of Lend-Lease, and you talked about Lal Stowe there, and they'd been banging the drum, and there'd been a lot of Eve Curry had been there in 1940, and the invasion, of course, and the Japanese invasion in the war was new, but it wasn't a new subject. People were aware of Burma if they read the international news, they were aware of Burma, and they were aware of the particular role that it played in the Japanese-Chinese dynamic. There's a question here, Richard, Philip, rather, from Richard Bellamy. Great. Given the speed and sometimes chaos of the retreat, does anyone know of any war correspondents, perhaps embedded in the fighting forces, were captured by the Japanese? I don't think we had any.
No, nobody was killed or captured. And some of the same correspondents would die later, particularly in the Italian campaign. But casualty rates amongst reporters were pretty high. And that's one of the things I was certainly very much influenced by, was the extent to which, a lot of them were in a lot of very dangerous positions in their reporting.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's made out as if they just, stood at headquarters and, sent the reports from there or from the bar in the Calcutta, but some did. Some were rogues.
Yeah.
But, the majority were trying their best to report as well as they could.
Yes, I mean they all came with baggage, political baggage. I think of Willie Burchett, and who was the Australian government absolutely hated him for his political views. But he, to my mind, he he exaggerated a little bit. A million died, wasn't that his book? But he, on the whole, represented the story pretty well. This is from another one from of this. Sorry, this is from Christopher Watts. He's asked two questions. First question is: when did coverage of the Northeast India-Burma campaign really change? Really become more upbeat? I refer in particular to the creation of Mountbatten, the image of a movie star.
Well, it's perhaps not much known, but when Mountbatten was appointed, I think the appointment of Charles Eade, who was going to be his publicity director, they were told by Churchill, I don't want any reporting for the next few months about Burma. I don't want any idea of an advance campaign. So it took a time until, into 1944. And certainly, I think by the last quarter of 1944, before that, certainly with Imphal and Kohima, the BBC being at Kohima, for instance, was a big step forward, I think. Yes, but yeah, Churchill was very ambivalent about the whole Burma operation, as you know. And the reporting of it was one thing you know, I think he believed that Mountbatten, the big flaw for Mountbatten was self-publicity. And in fact, he instructed that the generals were not allowed to broadcast to the troops. So Mountbatten wanted his own broadcasting unit. And he set aside a plane for himself just to go round to the soldiers and so forth, and make publicity for himself. So you could see why Churchill, was a bit worried about Mountbatten, but he did achieve a lot. And I support the idea that Mountbatten was good for Burma.
It's just worth just spending a minute on this because it's worth. Philip and I have had a private correspondence on this subject, but Sam Dalrymple's just produced a marvelous book called Shattered Lands. It's the story of the five partitions that made modern Asia, and it's what I have to think. I have to say I think it's my book of the year last year, but that's not to say I agree with everything in it, and I don't agree with his portrayal of Mountbatten, and his description of Kohima is very weak, but that doesn't matter. But I think what Sam's done is he's picked up this zeitgeist anti-Mountbatten stuff that doesn't fully understand the context of the time, and certainly from a military and a strategic perspective in the war, Mountbatten was very important.
He takes it from Mountbatten in India. This is the problem.
Yes,
I think, and there are lots of reasons to be critical of Mountbatten in India.
Yes,
but in Burma, it was a different story, I think.
That's a very, very good point. Christopher Watts makes the comment, must have been some sights, Scoons, Stopford and Christensen and Slim, of course, all knighted together in a ceremony on the Imphal Plain. Bill Slim actually describes this beautifully in his book, Defeat into Victory, where it's called the Plain of Knights. And I think it's the only time in history where, of course, 4 lieutenant generals were all marched onto the parade square and knighted on behalf of the king by the viceroy, Archie Wavell, who of course had been commander-in-chief India until June of the year before. And Bill Slim talks about giving the order, lieutenant generals by the left, quick march. I would have loved to have been there, but that would have been some ceremony. Yes, Jerry Bird, who of course very shortly in the next few months will be giving us a talk on the Dorsets at Kohima. Just on that subject, I'm sure someone's mentioned it now. Richard Sharp, you mentioned Richard Sharp being at Kohima, and that fantastic footage of the 13th of May with the Dorsets actually on the tennis court, filmed by Richard Sharp. 3 men got there by accident, didn't they? They sort of turned up in Dimapur and heard there was a bit of a scrap in the hills and went up to Dimapur. Richard Sharp's son is a very strong supporter of the KET. I've just noticed, had a look, he's not on tonight, but we'll probably listen to this and catch up. Anyway, Jerry says, fascinating webinar on a subject which is probably not very well known in the mainstream. Thank you, Philip. My question, are you aware if the Japanese had war correspondents embedded within their units in Burma and utilized the same sense as those of the Allies?
No, I'm sure they would have done. One of the problems in doing the research in COVID was that I didn't get to as many sort of sources as would have been possible before. But looking at other the way that the Japanese reported it. I'm pretty sure I would guess what the outcome was in that respect, and they would be very much more constrained, I imagine, than
Exactly.
the
Exactly.
the British and Indian reporters. I haven't mentioned the Indian reporters, but they were important.
Oh, well, there's a
Um,
question coming up, and it's very interesting actually from Jag again. But before we get there, Chris Dool has asked a question: did the reporting of the Burma campaign suffer simply due to geography, not close enough to Europe as North African campaign for Britain, not close enough to the Pacific Island campaign for America? Well, I think the answer very quickly is yes, Chris. Do buy Philip's book. Seriously, it's well worth it. You'll really enjoy it. Jag, who's a good friend of ours, has asked, how was the Indian language press dealt with, kept at bay? No, Jag, definitely not kept at bay. A lot of the Indian press, of course, was English, but I've recently, in the last few months, been looking at some of the Indian press uh, in Hindi, subsequently translated to English, and I'm really impressed at the quality of the reporting from Kohima. In fact, the book that I'm writing on Kohima now, I will be putting some of this in. I'm really, there were embedded Indian reporters in the 14th Army. So that number of 88 that Philip's mentioned, I don't know what percentage, Philip, were Indian, but a significant percentage were domestic reporters. And D.F. Karaka, this great, one of my favorite Indian reporters, and Philip talks about him in his book extensively, wrote a brilliant book called With the 14th Army, which is his account of being embedded in as a accredited war correspondent in Arakan, and I think in northern Burma in 1945, but certainly in Arakan, and he brings the campaign to life absolutely brilliantly. Right, we're running out of time. There's one from Silo Pasco. Oh, great. Okay, how was the war report in the Gold Coast? I'm interested in the Gold Coast Regiment. My father was Ghanaian. Well, fantastic. They played a remarkable role, but I think Philip's going to give you quite a depressing response here.
yes, I don't know the answer actually to
Well, I know that there were I think there might have been one embedded. This is in your book, one or two embedded journalists with the West Africans in Arakan, and the real problem was that they just weren't. No one really paid any attention to what they were doing, and yet you've listened to these webinars. You know actually that the 81st, 82nd West African divisions played a absolute blinder in Arakan in 1945. But they didn't. There was no one there to trumpet their virtues and to sing their praises.
It was a similar problem for the Black American reporters, very restricted on what they could do, and really very much a racial basis in how that was done, considering how important the contribution of the people working on the Burma Road was. Of,
Well, yeah, I mean,
yeah,
and the segregation is really is a subject that even now, after 35 years of studying this, I'm only just getting a sense of how segregated the American troops were. As you will all know, there were 270,000 American troops in the theater by 1945. A very large number of them were working on the Lido Road and on the Hump Airlift, and there were scores of thousands of black laborers in segregated battalions building the Lido Road. It's a subject that has been completely forgotten and yet does need to be brought back to life. We have absolutely run out of time. Philip, before we hand back to Sylvia, thank you very much indeed from me. And we've got a few more slides to bring the KET into context.
Well, may I add my thanks, Philip, to that marvellous presentation. And I have to say the statistics that you showed of the journalists who covered this battle and versus D-Day and versus other battles, you can quite understand how forgotten came into the name of both the army and the war. But it's wonderful that so much attention has been paid to it since, I think. And thank all of you for all your chat. We don't ignore your chat. Absolutely. I get a printed copy of it at the end, and I do circulate it to both Rob and our presenter of the evening. So Philip and Rob will get it, because I know there's lots of interesting facts in it tonight, as well as questions, and we will pick them up. But forgive us, we'll do it afterwards by email, if that's okay. And as already mentioned, Philip's most recent book is called Managing the Media. I'll give it another plug. It's a brilliant addition to your libraries, published by Bloomsbury, and as they say in the trade, is available at all good bookshops.
And in paperback.
We don't have copies yet on the KET store, but hopefully I can add it to our range very soon. Just to let you all know that work is progressing in Nagaland to hire teachers for our new project, the Mobile Teaching Unit, and it's expected to go live in the next couple of months. The plan is to reach 10 villages throughout the Tunsang and Mon districts, in particularly the rural areas where they face an acute shortage of teachers, in particular maths and science teachers. Working with our new partner ECS, the aim is to reach between 900 and 1,000 middle school students, and to ensure that over the next 3 years, each student will attain grade level numeracy and science literacy. And if you'd like to learn more about this project, please don't hesitate to ask, or of course, visit our website. And I'm sure Mel's fingers poised to put our website address back up on the chat. And here, of course, you will find our shop, which is full of beautiful Naga-made bags, jewellery, purses, gift cards and more. We also have a good selection of books about the Burma campaign, both new and second-hand, plus a wide selection of books by and about the Nagas. And we have Roby from Kohima with us tonight, which is fantastic because it was 3 in the morning or something, or 2 in the morning. And if there is nothing you fancy buying right now, remember we are a charity raising money to assist young Nagas with their education. We were founded by veterans of the battle, and every donation, however small, is greatly appreciated, helping to remember the past by giving to the future. Our next webinar will be on the 26th of February, and isn't that a glamorous photograph? We will be delighted to welcome Lucy Betteridge Dyson, who will be talking about the third Battle of the Arakan in 1945, entitled Jungle Commandos. Meantime, thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next time. From us all, good night.
Good night.
Good night.